Hale forced himself to look unfazed as he strode over to Julian and Emery, though every step felt heavier than the last. His chest tightened at the sight of them standing so close, the tension between them palpable. "What's going on here?" he asked, keeping his voice as light as possible. Julian turned to him with an easy smirk, his tone playful. "Ah, perfect timing. I was actually on my way to pick you up when I spotted your dear brother Emery here about to take an unscheduled swim." He placed a hand over his heart theatrically. "So, like the hero I am, I saved his life." "Again?" Hale arched a brow. "Again?" Julian nodded, tilting his head toward Emery. "First time was when he nearly got flattened by that car. But strangely, he's still hoarding his gratitude." Emery scowled, crossing his arms. "I already said thank you." Julian cupped a hand to his ear, feigning confusion. "Sorry, what was that?" "Must have been the wind. I didn't hear a thing." His smirk widened. "Come now, say it properly." Hale clenched his jaw as he watched the exchange, irritation creeping in. Julian was enjoying himself too much, and despite his obvious annoyance, Emery looked more flustered than furious. That didn't sit well with him. "That's enough," Hale cut in sharply, his voice firm. He stepped closer, his presence commanding. "Julian, let's go." Julian glanced at him, then back at Emery, eyes glinting with amusement. "So impatient," he murmured, before flashing Emery a knowing grin. "But fine. I'll just have to collect my gratitude some other time." Emery's face burned with embarrassment. Without another word, he spun on his heel and left, his hurried steps echoing against the deck. Hale barely spared him a glance before turning to Julian. "Come on," he muttered, already leading the way. Julian hummed in amusement, falling into step beside him as they made their way to his cabin. The moment Hale stepped into the cabin, his expression soured. His gaze swept over the small, modest space with clear disapproval. The cramped quarters, the worn-down furniture, and the creaky wooden bed did nothing to impress him. With his arms crossed, he remained standing, refusing to go anywhere near the bed. Julian, leaning casually against the door, smirked. "What's wrong? Not up to your standards?" Hale scoffed. "Halstead should get rid of third-class cabins altogether. Honestly, I hate being in poor environments." He wrinkled his nose. "But I suppose I can tolerate it, for you." Julian rolled his eyes, stepping closer. "How noble of you." He tugged at Hale's hand, guiding him toward the bed. "Come on, it's not that bad. You're acting like you'll catch a disease just by sitting down." Hale huffed but finally relented, perching himself on the edge as if the bed might swallow him whole. "You owe me for this," he muttered. Julian chuckled. "Oh, I plan to make it up to you." His voice dipped, smooth and enticing as he trailed his fingers along Hale's arm, his touch light but intentional. The teasing lilt in his voice, the way his lips hovered near Hale's ear, it was all deliberate. Julian knew how to play his cards well, and Hale, despite his earlier complaints, was falling right into it. The air between them grew thick with tension. Hale's breath hitched slightly as Julian's fingers brushed against his jaw, tilting his face just enough for their lips to nearly meet. And then, the door swung open. Nikki stepped inside, carrying a tray of food. His timing was impeccable. "Oh." Nikki froze, his eyes darting between them. "Sorry." Julian sighed, pulling back while Hale exhaled in frustration, the spell broken. But then, his gaze landed on Nikki, and just like that, his mood shifted. "Well," Hale mused, taking in Nikki's features with open appreciation. "Aren't you a pleasant surprise?" Julian smirked, shaking his head. "Careful. That's my cousin you're ogling." Hale looked mildly amused. "Cousin? You two don't look alike." Julian shrugged. "We're both fishermen. Family trade." At that, Hale laughed. That's funny. He reminds me of a village boy who used to follow my brother, me, and our old friend around when we were kids. Nikki, who had been silently placing the tray on the small table, stiffened. For a split second, something flickered in his eyes, annoyance, perhaps, but he quickly masked it. I see, Nikki said, keeping his voice neutral. Well, enjoy your meal. Without another word, he turned and left, shutting the door behind him. Julian sighed, shaking his head. You really should be more careful with your words. Hale blinked at him. What? What did I do? Julian gave him a knowing look. You don't always realize when you're dismissing people, do you? Hale simply waved him off. If he's upset over nothing, that's his problem. Julian chuckled, deciding to drop the topic. Instead, he moved closer again, his fingers skimming over Hale's thigh. Now, where were we? Hale smirked. You tell me. Things escalated quickly after that. Dinner was forgotten as their hands wandered, touches growing more heated, kisses more desperate. Soon, the tension that had been simmering between them exploded into something far more intense. Later, as they lay tangled together in the dimly lit cabin, their breaths still uneven, Hale found his thoughts drifting. He hadn't meant to, but an image flashed through his mind, Julian and Emery standing by the docks, their interaction earlier. There was something natural about the way they looked together. Frowning slightly, Hale turned to Julian, trailing his fingers down his chest. What do you think of my brother? Julian, half asleep, blinked in mild confusion. What? Hale's gaze was steady. Emery. What do you think of him? Julian hesitated, the question catching him off guard. I don't think much of him. He stretched lazily before adding, I guess he's a good person, but he's too stiff. Needs to loosen up. He smirked. Honestly, he's fun to mess with. Hale chuckled at that. That he is. But something still nagged at him, so he pushed further. Do you think he's pretty? Julian's mind flickered back to that moment, when he had pulled Emery away from the railing, how the moonlight had caught in his hair, how his eyes had burned with something unspoken. He had thought he was beautiful then. But he shoved the thought aside, turning to Hale with a smirk. Not my type. His voice was firm, final. Now, let's not talk about him anymore. I'd rather focus on us. That was all Hale needed to hear. Satisfied, he leaned in and captured Julian's lips in another deep kiss, and just like that, the night continued. The next morning, Emery sat at the lounge table with his father, Olivia, and Ethan, enjoying a quiet breakfast. The air was light, filled with the soft clinking of silverware against porcelain and the murmur of conversation. Olivia, ever the observant one, glanced around before asking, "Where's Hale?" "He's usually up by now." Emery barely hesitated before replying, "He went to bed late." It was a lie, of course. He knew exactly where Hale had been, but he wasn't about to say it out loud. Olivia arched a brow, not entirely convinced, but before she could probe further, Hale strolled into the lounge. His expression was a mixture of exhaustion and uncontainable excitement, his usual grace tinged with a rare unfiltered joy. "Good morning, everyone," he greeted, his voice brighter than usual. Emery didn't need to ask why Hale was in such a good mood. He already knew. He could see it in the way Hale carried himself, the satisfied glow, the barely restrained smirk. It was all too obvious. Ethan, burning with jealousy, spoke. "You look like you had a long night." Hale smirked but said nothing, merely grabbing a cup of coffee and settling into his chair. Meanwhile, Devon leaned toward Emery, lowering his voice just enough for only him to hear. "We will be arriving in Brighton by tomorrow. Do be careful with what you say around others. No one needs to know about your little monk ambitions." Emery, unfazed, met his father's gaze head-on. "I don't see why I should hide it." Devon's expression darkened, but before he could respond, Emery continued, his voice louder, making sure everyone at the table could hear. In fact, I plan to continue the housing project for the poor that the late Richard St. Clair wanted to start. Silence fell over the table. Devon's jaw tensed, his grip on his fork tightening. Olivia and Ethan exchanged wary glances, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Even Hale, still basking in his own private glow, suddenly looked uncomfortable. At that moment, Julian and Nikki entered the lounge, pausing just inside the doorway as Julian caught the tail end of Emery's words. His entire body went rigid. Richard St. Clair. His father. The name hit him like a blow to the chest, sending a wave of barely restrained fury coursing through his veins. His gaze locked onto Emery, his mind racing. Does he not know that his father, Devon Montgomery, was the very man responsible for his father Richard St. Clair's death? That it was because of Devon that Julian had been forced to hide his identity, to live a life built on deception and vengeance. And yet, here Emery was, speaking so casually about honoring Richard's legacy, as if he had any right to carry on the wishes of a man his own father had helped destroy. Julian's hands curled into fists at his sides. He swallowed the rage that threatened to spill over, his face remaining carefully neutral. But inside, he seethed. Nikki, ever perceptive, glanced at Julian and immediately recognized the shift in his demeanor. He placed a steadying hand on his arm. Julian didn't acknowledge it. His eyes stayed on Emery, studying him, assessing him. What game are you playing, Montgomery? One thing was certain, he would find out. Just then, a smooth voice crackled through the speakers, announcing an upcoming ball hosted by the Halstead Company, a grand event meant to thank everyone for their patronage. The news was met with excitement, murmurs of anticipation filling the lounge as guests buzzed about what they would wear and who they would dance with. Everyone seemed to be looking forward to it, everyone except Julian. He sat at the breakfast table with Nikki, arms crossed, his jaw tight. The food on his plate had barely been touched. He was still stewing over what Emery had said earlier, his mind running in circles. Nikki nudged him with his foot under the table. Are you going to brood all day or eat something? Julian exhaled sharply, pushing his plate away. I lost my appetite. Nikki rolled his eyes but let it go. Meanwhile, across the room, Emery finished his breakfast. He wiped his mouth with a napkin, excused himself, and stood up to leave. Julian barely spared him a glance, though the moment Emery walked out, his gaze instinctively followed. On the deck, the salty breeze ruffled Emery's hair as he leaned against the railing, camera in hand. The sea stretched endlessly before him, sunlight shimmering on its surface. He lifted the camera, adjusting the lens, capturing the beauty of the waves, the elegance of the ship, the simple details of the deck. Click. Just as he lowered the camera, he realized he had unintentionally snapped a picture of Julian, who was striding toward him with a look of determination in his eyes. Emery blinked. Before he could apologize, Julian was already in front of him. You took my picture, Julian said flatly, his sharp eyes narrowing. It was a mistake, Emery answered quickly, flustered. I was taking a picture of the deck. Julian didn't seem interested in arguing. Instead, he crossed his arms and got straight to the point. I want in on your housing project. Emery stared at him, caught completely off guard. What? I heard you talking about it this morning, Julian clarified. I want to help. Emery didn't know what shocked him more, the fact that Julian had overheard him or that he was actually offering to help. He hesitated, searching Julian's face for any sign of insincerity, but all he found was seriousness. A genuine smile tugged at Emery's lips. Thank you. I appreciate that. Julian stared. It was the first time he had seen Emery smile at him so openly. It was soft, unguarded, beautiful in a way he hadn't expected. Emery sighed, glancing at the sea. But I don't even know how it'll be funded. It's something I've wanted to do for a long time, but without sponsorship, it's just a dream. Julian didn't hesitate. Then I'll get you the sponsorship. Emery's head snapped toward him. You will. Julian nodded. I'll make sure you have what you need. There it was again, that happiness on Emery's face, lighting up his features. It hit Julian in a way he couldn't explain. His chest tightened, his heartbeat just a fraction too fast. Why does he look so damn happy? Julian clenched his jaw, willing himself to ignore the strange pull in his chest. Instead, he reminded himself of the real reason he was doing this. There must be more to Emery's interest in my father's project. I need to figure out what it is. But even as he told himself that, he couldn't shake the image of Emery's smile, or the way it made something inside him falter. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe to the channel for more episodes.